All right, guys, so this is the last video for the chapter on the brain. And so last time we finished by talking about the diencephalon, so the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. So now we're going to move on to the brainstem. So the brainstem sits just below the diencephalon. So if we look kind of back up at this picture here, all right, remember our purple here was all our diencephalon. And so now our brainstem is going to be all of this in the different shades of green. All right, that's going to be our brainstem. So we're just going to go through the structures kind of starting most superiorly and work our way down. Okay, and before we do that, just a couple of reminders, some terminology. So gray matter are going to be nuclei, all right? These are going to have specific functions. And then white matter are going to be tracts. They can be sensory or motor. So as we go through each section, we'll talk about any tracts that are present, and then we'll talk about any nuclei that are present in each of our kind of divisions of the brainstem. Okay, and then at the very end, we're going to talk about the cranial nerves, because the cranial nerves typically are going to enter and exit primarily through the different parts of the brain stem. So we'll go through the cranial nerves at the very end. All right, so our first region of the brainstem is the midbrain, or the mesencephalon. Okay, and so if we're looking at this picture, all right, so this purple here, that would be the thalamus. All right, you can see the hypothalamus part of it kind of coming off of the front here. All right, just below that, the green we can see here, all right, that's the midbrain, or the mesencephalon. Okay, so let's talk about tracts in the midbrain first. All right, and so the most prominent tracts, and you can see them in this picture, these two kind of big trunks here, all right, these are called cerebral peduncles. Okay, and so the cerebral peduncles, they're ventral bulges, right? That's what we're looking at, these bulges on the front side of the brainstem, and they carry somatic motor information. All right, so they're going to be bringing information from that prefrontal cortex down, all right, to send it to the spinal cord so it can reach the muscles. Okay, so these would be specifically pyramidal tracts. Okay. All right. There are also sensory tracts located in the mesencephalon, right, the midbrain. These are particularly associated with pain, actually more so even pain suppression, right, and perceived fear. So it actually kind of, the midbrain functions to link perceived fears with the autonomic nervous system, which produces the response to those fears. Okay, so those are some sensory tracts. All right, and then we're going to talk when we get to the cerebellum about how it connects to each of the parts of the brainstem, but there are connections and tracts from this midbrain that go to the cerebellum as well. Okay, so let's talk about nuclei now. All right, so if we kind of cross section, right, do a transverse section like this, all right, through that midbrain, this is what we're going to be looking at. So if we look kind of from the top down at that cross section, this is what we're looking at. So we have our cerebral peduncles, those big front bulges here on either side. Those would match up to these structures here. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. And so we can point out some of the nuclei from this picture. All right, so the first one we're going to talk about is the substantia nigra. All right, so those are going to be, get my pen, all right, these kind of dark brown shape, or dark brown kind of comma shaped structures here. Okay, and so the substantia nigra are what are going to make dopamine, and they're going to send that dopamine up to those higher brain regions that we talked about before. All right, so they're going to send it up to the basal nuclei. All right, so we can do make dopamine. It's going to send those to the basal nuclei. Because remember the last video we talked about with those basal nuclei, they help to kind of regulate movement and the start and stop of movements and make them appropriate. And they use dopamine for that purpose. And so that dopamine is coming from the substantia nigra located here in that midbrain. All right, and so the substantia nigra has this kind of brownish, almost black color, all right, when you look at a cross section, because it contains a lot of melanin. And that's because melanin is actually a precursor for dopamine. All right, so melanin present there in the substantia nigra gives it its color, right? And it's there because it's a precursor for dopamine. And I will actually define this, right? I'm just so used to abbreviating dopamine like that. Just in case you're not aware, dopamine, DA is just standing for dopamine. Okay? So that's the substantia nigra. Also in the, let's see, I'm just going to erase so we don't have a bunch of crossing lines. There we go. Also in the midbrain, we have another nucleus called the red nucleus, which hopefully is very easy to pick out. All right, it's just this red circle, 2 of them. All right, so these are the red nuclei. And they kind of act as a motor relay station. So they connect motor information from the basal nuclei, from the cortex, from the cerebellum, and kind of integrate all of it. Okay, so it's a motor relay station. And it's red because it has a very rich blood supply, and it actually has a lot of iron as well. So it gives it that red color. All right, and then lastly for the midbrain, the last nuclei we're going to talk about are called the corpora quadrigemina. Okay, and so the quad part here, all right, is referring to that it's actually 4 kind of separate bulges or nuclei that you can see. And so if we look at the midbrain from the back, posteriorly, you can see them here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, those are the corpora quadrigemina. So our cross section up at the top, you can kind of see part of them here sticking off of the back. Okay, so they're posterior and they're typically kind of tucked behind the cerebellum. All right, so we can divide them further into our superior kind of bulges. Those are called the superior colliculi. All right, that's going to be these 2 up here. And we have inferior colliculi, which are these 2 below. Okay, so let's talk about their functions. So with the superior colliculi, they're going to be associated with eye movement. All right, so most of these are kind of reflex based, right? Both of these 2 colliculi. All right, so superior ones coordinate, all right, head and eye movement. Okay, and so in particular, this is going to be important when you're tracking something, so visually, right? So when your eyes, and this is kind of a reflex, your eyes track something and follow something, right? It'll coordinate movement of your eyes with movement of your head while you're following, you know, whatever it is, somebody walking by or a bird flying by, you know, something like that. Okay, so that's the superior colliculi. Then we have the inferior colliculi. All right, so again, that's these 2 on the bottom. All right, and they're going to be associated with auditory reflexes, especially, all right, the startle reflex. So if you hear something loud, all right, it kind of startles you, and you automatically will turn, right, your head towards that sound to kind of help you localize where it's coming from. So that reflex is kind of managed by this inferior colliculus. Okay. All right, so that is our midbrain. So we have our tracts, right? Primarily motor. There's some sensory as well. And then we have our nuclei, so the substantia nigra, the red nucleus, and the corpora quadrigemina. All right, so let's keep moving downwards. So our next structure of the brainstem is the pons. All right, so let's point it out on this picture. All right, so this was our midbrain that we were just looking at here. All right, so this is going to be the pons here. Okay, and so the pons has a kind of very large bulge on the front like this. All right, so that's the pons. And so with the pons, Tracts, it has both sensory and motor. All right, and its job is it's going to connect the cortex and kind of some upper brain regions to the cerebellum. Okay, so it's kind of a bridge, all right, that connects Tracts from the higher brain regions to the cerebellum. Okay, and so it does that through, and we're going to look at this when we look at our cerebellum, through structures called the cerebellar peduncles. Okay, and so peduncles are just referring to kind of these thick collections of tracts. All right, also in the pons, really important, you'll learn about this more in A&P 2 when you do respiratory system. There's a collection of nuclei in the pons that relate to the respiratory system, right? Respiratory function. Especially these nuclei, right, set the normal breathing rhythm. All right, so they set the breathing rate. Okay, good. So that's the pons, all right? Pons is pretty simple. And then lastly, we have the medulla. So the medulla oblongata, all right? And so that is going to be this structure here. That's our medulla oblongata. Okay, so let's start with our tracts of the medulla. And so in the medulla, very, very important tracts are the motor tracts. All right, so it contains these pyramidal tracts that run down the front. And so this would be our medulla if we're looking kind of straight on at the brainstem. So it has these thick kind of trunks here and here. All right, so these are where the pyramidal tracts run. Okay, so they run down the front side of the medulla. They carry that voluntary motor information. All right, and a very important structure in this medulla associated with these pyramidal tracts is the decussation of pyramids. Okay, and so this is the point where our somatic motor information crosses over. All right, so crosses over because remember, everything is contralateral in the brain. All right, so the right side of the brain, the premotor cortex or the prefrontal cortex controls muscles on the left side of the body. All right, so that crossing over of that information to reach that other side happens here at this decussation of pyramids in the medulla oblongata. All right. Okay, so that's for our motor. There are also sensory tracts in the medulla oblongata, and these are associated with proprioception, which we talked about a little before. Among other things, there's going to be lots of sensory information moving from the spinal cord up through the medulla, but of particular importance, and this is going to be passed through the cerebellum, is going to be information for proprioception. Okay, and that's going to be more so on the posterior side, all right, of the medulla. All right, so it's going to go through the posterior side, and then here, right, it'll divert off and go to the cerebellum. Okay, because the cerebellum helps to kind of make sense of all that proprioception information. All right. Okay, so let's talk nuclei, because there are many very, very important nuclei in the medulla. All right, and so this is one region. If you sustain an injury to your brainstem that is very quickly fatal, all right, that would likely be related to this medulla because of the really vital functions that are performed there. So the nuclei, that's where it would happen. So the nuclei in the medulla, there are several vital centers. All right, so let's talk about specifically these three and what they do. So we have the cardiac center. All right, this cardiac center is going to help to control heart rate. Okay, so it kind of sets the normal baseline heart rate. And then we know that your autonomic nervous system can kind of act on that to elevate your heart rate or slow it down. But it's set by kind of this cardiac center. Okay. And then we have our respiratory center. All right, so this is going to work with the pons to kind of regulate breathing and the rate of breathing and how deeply you breathe in and out and that sort of thing. All right, so it's going to work with the pons and that respiratory center we talked about with the pons. And then lastly, we have the vasomotor center. So this is concerned with constriction and dilation of blood vessels. All right. Just meaning it can change the diameter of the blood vessels in your body, and that actually will affect your blood pressure. All right, so of blood vessels. All right, and that will affect blood pressure as well. Okay. Also in the medulla, there are some non-vital centers with very interesting functions. So there's regions in the medulla that control kind of things that are involuntary, like coughing, sneezing, yawning, vomiting. All those kind of centers are also located in the medulla. Okay. All right, so that's the brainstem. So now let's talk about the cerebellum. Okay, so the cerebellum sits kind of posterior to the brainstem. All right, so this would be the cerebellum here. All right, and you can actually see those corpora quadrigemina up here. All right, this would be the pons here. And then that medulla we were just talking about right here, just so we're oriented. Okay, and so the cerebellum functions primarily for equilibrium. All right, and coordination. So before we get into some of these kind of functional things, let's talk a little bit about its anatomy. All right, so the anatomy of the cerebellum, if we kind of cut into it, and first of all, what we're cutting into here, all right, to get this like mid-sagittal section here, all right, is called the vermis. Okay, so the vermis is a structure in the cerebellum that connects the right and left hemispheres of the cerebellum. All right, so it connects right and left hemispheres. Okay, so that's going to be the vermis. So it's connecting left and right. And then when you cut mid-sagittally and look at the cerebellum, you can see, right, we have these areas of white matter kind of in the middle, all right, and they branch out kind of in this almost like tree-looking structure, all right, with gray matter on the outside, right, kind of like a gray matter cortex like we saw in the cerebrum, all right, we also see that in the cerebellum. And so this kind of structure, this tree-like structure is called the arbor vitae. All right, so it's that area of inner white matter with the kind of outer cortex of gray matter that we see in the cerebellum. All right, so arbor vitae meaning tree of life. Okay, good. So that's the anatomy and the structure. We also mentioned that the cerebellum is connected to the other parts of the brainstem. All right, so let's talk about how it does that. So those were the peduncles. So there are 3 peduncles. You can see them here. All right, so these 3 kind of trunks that go to the cerebellum here. Okay, so we have our superior cerebellar peduncle. I'm only going to write out completely one of these, all right? But this superior one, the superior cerebellar peduncle, just remember it's connected to the top of the brainstem, all right? So it connects the cerebellum to the midbrain. All right, that mesencephalon. And then the middle, all right, we'll just abbreviate this cerebellar peduncle. all right, is going to connect the cerebellum to, you guessed it, the pons, all right, the middle part of the brainstem. And then the inferior cerebellar peduncle is going to connect the cerebellum to the medulla. All right, so those three different peduncles are going to connect the cerebellum to the three different parts of the brainstem. So the cerebellum receives information from all of those different regions. It also kind of transmits information because it's all working together to help that cerebellum process where your body is, that proprioception information about body position and coordination, and it helps to output, motor information that helps you keep your balance and remain coordinated. So it has to communicate with all these other regions in order to be able to do that. Okay, all right, so we've talked about proprioception, good, and balance and coordination. Okay, so it helps to coordinate muscles, all right, and it also helps to smooth muscle movement. All right, so it's really important for kind of fine-tuning any movements before they're sent out to the actual muscles. Okay. Good. All right. And so with the cerebellum, if there's damage to the cerebellum, you are going to see what is called ataxia. So ataxia is just a loss of coordination. All right. So that's associated with damage to the cerebellum. All right. Good. And so our final topic before we talk about the cranial nerves is we're just going to mention a couple of brain systems. And so these are just systems that kind of pull together. It's kind of like different regions of the brain that all work together for a certain function. So there's two of those we're going to talk about. The first one is the limbic system. All right. And so the limbic system is involved in kind of emotions and memory, all right? And it connects your emotions and your memories to many other parts of the brain, okay? So primarily parts of the limbic system are found in the cerebrum and the diencephalon, all right? So the cerebrum and diencephalon. All right, and it's important for emotions and memory. Okay, so let's talk about some specific brain regions associated with the limbic system. All right, and so the first one is the amygdala. So the amygdala is kind of part of that fight or flight fear response. All right, so it's going to take its job, kind of what the amygdala does is it receives information about a perceived threat. All right, and it helps to coordinate that response. All right, so whether it's fight or flight, right, it's going to be involved in that response to some sort of threat. Right, then we have the cingulate gyrus. All right, so the cingulate gyrus is involved with emotions, but particularly, and it's kind of interesting, is it specifically is related to expressing emotions through gestures. All right, so it kind of coordinates your emotions with your somatic motor movements, right? Gestures, facial expressions, that kind of thing. All right, so that's the cingulate gyrus. And then we have the fornix, all right? So the fornix is actually, it's not a gray matter area, right? It's a collection of tracts or fibers. All right, and it's actually, this is going to be part of the limbic system that connects the kind of various aspects of the limbic system. All right. So it's kind of the connecting region. All right, so it just connects parts of the limbic system. Okay, and then lastly we have the hippocampus. And so the hippocampus, it is involved with memories, right? And it's going to help to connect memories to emotions. So it links them to emotions. Okay. All right, so those are some important parts of the limbic system. And so we have one more system to talk about, all right? And that is going to involve the reticular formation or the reticular activating center. Okay, and so this is going to involve kind of little parts from all the different areas of the brainstem. So midbrain, pons, and medulla. The overall function of this reticular activating center is to keep the cortex kind of alert and conscious. That's its default function. So reticular activating center is constantly kind of arousing and waking up that cortex and keeping it constantly, conscious and aware. And it actually has another extremely important function in filtering sensory information. So, for example, if you wear glasses, all right, you may put them on in the morning and feel them for like a minute, and then after that, you don't feel your glasses sitting on your face unless you move them, all right, and that's because this reticular activating center is filtering out that sensory information, all right, and because we get so much sensory information throughout the day, it is extremely important that this reticular activating center kind of reduces that information. If you just think about, right, while you're sitting there listening to this video, right, you're sitting in a chair or laying in bed, right, you don't feel that chair that you're sitting on or the bed you're laying in. You don't feel the clothes you're wearing, all right? That's because it's all being filtered out. So something very interesting is that LSD, all right, the drug LSD affects the ability of the reticular activating center to actually filter this information, all right? So it inhibits this ability. All right, so that's why often people, when they take LSD, they have this feeling of kind of sensory overload, right? They can feel everything, and that's because essentially they can, all right? Their reticular activating center isn't filtering out that kind of non-essential information. Okay, so let's continue with our kind of consciousness and awareness function of the reticular activating center. When you're asleep, something that's interesting about this is that it can wake the brain, right, based on sounds. So, if you maybe have like a new baby or something, or you hear like a crash downstairs in the house, that'll wake you up. However, the reticular activating center is not connected to smell. So if there is, say, a fire in your house, you're not going to smell the smoke and wake up, which is why we have fire alarms, all right? Because you need that sound to wake you up, okay? All right, and so the reticular activating center, obviously, you're not constantly awake. You do go to sleep. So it's inhibited by sleep centers in the brain. All right. Here we go. So sleep centers, particularly, or if you remember in the hypothalamus, there are sleep centers. It can also be inhibited by things like alcohol, all right, which can make you tired and sleepy. Tranquilizers will act on this reticular activating center. Right, and it can be, from a sudden blow or something like that, right? If somebody gets maybe punched really hard in the face and it kind of turns their neck the wrong way, you could damage this reticular activating center, all right? And that could lead to a coma, all right? So damage because you're kind of shutting off this area that's keeping your cerebrum aroused, All right, and so then if you're shutting that off, you could end up in, a coma. Okay, good. All right, and so just the last little note on this, there are 2 neurotransmitters kind of associated with this area. So the one that kind of keeps you in that state of arousal is norepinephrine. All right, and so then when this area is going to be inhibited by, the sleep centers from the hypothalamus, the neurotransmitter responsible for that is serotonin. So this is kind of the sleep promoting neurotransmitter in this reticular activating center. Okay, good. All right, and then in your notes, we mentioned a little bit about brain injuries. And so talking about stroke, so a stroke just being, a loss of blood supply to a specific region of the brain. And so when the brain loses blood supply, it's not getting enough oxygen or nutrients, and that can damage sometimes permanently different areas of the brain. All right, and increasing intracranial pressure. We talked about that a little bit with CSF. All right, so CSF should be drained into the superior sagittal sinus, all right, and it should be made at a constant rate. And so if there's not a balance between those two, you'll have an increase in pressure in the brain, which can damage the brain and hinder brain function. Okay, so now let's just briefly talk about the cranial nerves. All right, and so I want you guys, mainly as a way to study these, to go through, and I will post this kind of diagram here. I'll post it as a separate page on iCollege for you so you can access it, because I think it's helpful. I drew this just as a way of kind of organizing the information. But I think a good way to study it is to go through, and on your chapter notes, there's a list of the cranial nerves, and you should know for each one if it carries sensory information, motor information, or both. And then you should kind of generally know what type of information that is, right? So if it's motor information, it's motor information that's going where, right? What is it talking to? If it's sensory, what type of sensory information is that, right? Where's it coming from? Okay, so fill that out on your chapter notes as a way to review, but we'll just briefly kind of go through these really quick. Okay, and I'll just show you kind of how this picture works and how I made it. All right, so let's start with cranial nerve number 1. And so on this picture, when you see, where's number 1? So here's number 1. All right, the olfactory nerve. All right, when you see green, all right, green means it's a sensory nerve, and purple means it's a motor nerve. So with olfactory, that's going to be sensory information. All right, so it's up here just above that nasal cavity. This is information for smell. So as an example of how to fill in your lecture notes, all right, you would say this just carries sensory information, and kind of what type of information or its function would be information about smell. All right, and so it would go to the brain and to that olfactory center in the cortex to be interpreted. All right, and then cranial nerve number 2 is the optic nerve. All right, that is all sensory. It's going to take information from the eye, from the retina, about vision, and take that to the brain. All right, number 3, oculomotor. So this is purple, only purple, so that means it's motor. All right, and so this information is actually going to, so oculo, eye, motor, kind of movement. All right, and this is going to be for movement of the eye. So this innervates some of the skeletal muscles around the eye to help you move your eye. All right, cranial nerve number 4 is down here. The trochlear nerve, again, this is motor. It's another nerve that controls, it's just a different muscle from the oculomotor, all right? So, but it controls a muscle that controls movement of the eye. So that's trochlear. So then number 5, trigeminal, we have here. So the trigeminal, you can see we have green and we have purple. So this is going to be mixed. So it's both sensory and motor. So the trigeminal for motor, it's going to control a muscle here, All right, the masseter muscle, the masseter muscle that helps you chew food. Okay, so it's going to help with chewing. All right, and then the sensory part, the green, is going to be sensation and touch for the face. All right, so this is kind of going all over the face for sensory. All right, so sensory for the face. So that's the trigeminal. Number 6 is the abducens. That is another motor muscle for the eye. All right, so movement of the eye. There are 3 nerves that carry motor information for moving the eye. Okay, so the oculomotor nerve, the trochlear nerve, and the abducens nerve. Okay. And then we have the facial nerve. All right, so this is another mixed one, motor and sensory. So the motor part for the facial nerve has a few functions. And so one, it goes to tear glands, so lacrimal glands in the eye. That's kind of what you're seeing here. All right. 2, it goes to the salivary glands. All right, so it's involved in, salivation. And then 3, it controls some, the skeletal muscles of the face. All right, so it'll be involved in facial expressions and some of those face muscles we learned in that chapter, right? It'll control those. Okay, and then so that's our motor part. So 3 motor functions. And then our sensory function for the facial muscle is taste. Right, so it's going to the tongue. Right, so it carries information, sensory information about taste. All right, and then cranial nerve number 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. And so this will look more familiar when we actually learn about the ear. All right, but this nerve goes to the ear and it receives only sensory information, all right, but it's 2 types. So from here, the cochlea of the ear, this is where sound is actually interpreted. So it takes information about sound. All right, and then also information from the vestibule and these semicircular canals about kind of balance and equilibrium. So it carries both those information types. Okay, so sound, right, or hearing, and balance and equilibrium. All right, so that's the vestibulocochlear. And then we have number 9, our glossopharyngeal. We're going to move back up here. All right, so this is our glossopharyngeal nerve. It's mixed, motory and sensor. Motory and sensor. Let's try sensory and motor. That probably makes a little more sense. So the sensory is going to be also taste. All right, so facial for taste as well as glossopharyngeal. And then the motor part is going to be for salivary glands as well as muscles you can see here of the pharynx. All right, these are muscles that are involved in swallowing. All right. So one of the major nerves that you're going to hear about over and over again in A&P2, that is cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve. All right, so this is a mixed nerve. It only has one sensory function, which is taste. So that's 3 nerves now that carry information about taste. Okay, so the vagus nerve has the sensory function of taste, and then it has a wide variety of motor functions. So it's involved with a lot of visceral kind of functions. So movement of the stomach and the intestines, right? The activity of the liver, the lungs, the heart, right? It carries information from the autonomic nervous system that helps to regulate all of those things. It's also involved in swallowing and the muscles that help you to speak. So, vocalization, all right? So many functions for the vagus nerve. Okay, so that's number 10. And then number 11, our accessory nerve is just motor. Okay, and so it innervates accessory muscles. So the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius, these are accessory muscles for, in part, breathing. All right, the sternocleidomastoid. Okay, so those are innervated by the accessory nerve. And then lastly, we have the hypoglossal nerve. And so this is the nerve, it's only motor, that innervates the tongue and is involved in movement of the tongue. Okay, so work on those. This is perfect information to use to make flashcards. All right, so I would make a set of flashcards for each nerve as to whether it's sensory, motor, or both, and then make another set for each nerve as to its kind of function or the type of information it carries. Okay, so that's it for the brain chapter. All right, in the next chapter, we're going to start talking about the spinal cord.